Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, it's now been over 5 weeks since the release of the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion for Elden Ring, and in that time you may have noticed from, well, all the videos, I've played an absolutely obscene amount of this, and having noted my playtime before the DLC, and since then, I can tell you that I'm currently a bit over 260 hours just since the release of the expansion itself, which yes, does average out to around 7 hours a day. I realize that, I know you're gonna say it in the comments, I don't need you to tell me, so let's just be clear about it from the start. Point being, I have played a lot, maybe a bit too much. I have experienced every nook and cranny of the DLC, I have messed around a fair bit with every new weapon and a lot of the other new things too, and so today, with so much time under my belt, I want to look back at my experience and have a sort of discussion slash reviewy type deal where I talk about where my thoughts have landed on the DLC, now that we've actually had a lot of time to digest it all. First up, we should start at the hottest topic, the difficulty. And this, hilariously, sort of goes both ways. The people who found this DLC to be overly, unfairly difficult are the people who put unnecessary restraints upon themselves. I will never tell someone else how to play the game. I think the beauty of Elden Ring specifically over all previous Soulsborne type titles is the sheer amount of variety and player choice within your actual setup and how you play. But the truth is, the more limitations you place on yourself, the better you have to be as a player and the stronger your knowledge has to be to compensate. There's nothing wrong with using summons, but if you aren't going to use summons, you need to be stronger yourself to make up that gap. There's nothing wrong with being a sorcerer, but if you're going to say that you think magic is dirty, then you will need to be better at playing melee to make up that gap as well. The same goes on and on for every one of the limitations that people just randomly decide to go with. And this isn't just a skill thing that I'm talking about either, because it's also heavily knowledge-based. The game and DLC are fully completable to the point of being able to be made goddamn easy, provided that you are willing and able to put together a good build. Sure, there are crazy one-shot builds or the stupidly powerful builds that almost make bosses sort of too easy and it doesn't even feel fair to them at that point, but there is just this whole spectrum in between that and not having a build at all. In my experience, seeing the gameplay of the people who said the game is too hard, they either were completely purposefully ignoring the Shadow Tree blessings, they had no build at all, or just an incomplete one, not a well-structured one, and they always swore off of summons and such and all that type of stuff. Shadow of the Erdtree, like the base game before it, is exactly how hard you choose to make it. The difficulty slider of this game is in your build itself. Jumping bleed swords, easy mode. Naked RL1 with no weapon upgrades, goddamn mega hard mode. And you could use hundreds of different steps in between those so long as you have the knowledge of what makes a good build in the game. Overall, what I'm trying to say is, in the least inflammatory way possible, get good, but not in the way that this is meant in Souls games in the past. I don't mean you need to play better, you need to be better at the actual moment-to-moment combat. I mean play smarter. I think the difficulty is entirely capable of being overcome no matter what, and so calling it too hard is just the wrong terminology. I think a better discussion to have about this would be how they've chosen to make it hard. Every boss has at least 1 or 2 roll catches, not just combos with mismatched timings to punish people who spam rolls, but attacks where they will raise their weapon like they're about to swing, or they'll drag it along the floor for a really long time and just wait and wait and wait and then smack you. And these are built from the ground up to catch people out, to force you to learn through repetition rather than pure reaction. Past that, a number of bosses also have ridiculously long combos, the best examples in my opinion being Commander Gaius, who will just swing forever if you actually let him, and specifically the second phase of Radahn, who between the sword swings and the holy aftershocks of light feels like he just never gives you a moment to breathe unless you force it out of him. The main issue I have with those two bosses, though, isn't even the length of their combos, it is the length of the opening to punish them after the combo. If a combo is that long, it should feel rewarding to fully dodge it. It shouldn't be just one attack that you get to do afterwards, that just feels weird. Other than that, I think a good number of the Remembrance boss arenas need to be about 30 to 50% bigger as well, specific ones being Divine Beast, whose camera goes wonky a lot due to the walls, Golden Hippo, who, while not a Remembrance boss, I understand that, is a massive beast with a ton of charge attacks that often push you towards the walls of his frankly tiny arena. Then there's Midra, who has a phase transition explosion with a massive radius on it that will chase you down, and the room is just so small that sometimes you can't even positionally run out of the danger zone before it pops, to the point that oftentimes I just purposefully choose to tank the attack so that I can get back up and start applying damage again as soon as possible. Outside of these gripes though, I think the bosses are incredible. I think the difficulty is honestly perfect for a DLC for the specific game that Elden Ring is. It isn't a Souls game, it is its own beast, and this beast exists to let you create extremely detailed, complex builds. Not to mention that, again, I need to mention that choosing not to use summons is a respectable decision, sure, but it's not one that is forced upon any player that exists in the world. As for my thoughts on the bosses themselves, I had a whole tier list go up recently about all of them, but my top 3 are Messmer at the very top because I love his fight pacing, his combos don't feel overly long, the rhythm of his attacks is very satisfying to deal with, and he actually gives you a lot of chunky sized openings to punish him if you correctly dodge his larger attacks and his combo finishers. Not to mention his lore and cutscenes being pretty damn incredible too. Second for me then is Rolana, again for pretty much all the same reasons, really satisfying attack rhythms, reasonably large openings, and while the combos are longer, there are a lot of ways to just sort of positionally dodge them and get in some extra damage by moving around her, which is neat as well. Her theme music as well is one of my favorite tracks in the whole game, and then third for me is Midra. I think this is one of the more immersive, atmospheric moments of the whole DLC, when the phase transition happens after killing tiny little guy Midra before he's a boss, then he turns into the proper Lord of Frenzied Flame, ripping out the sword and his head along with it, the room lights on fire, and you're just looking into the void while it stares back at you, trying to fill you with madness. And then I also love the actual combat side of it too, because of how uniquely scriptable this fight feels. At the start of the fight, you will always do the same attack. It is fully avoidable by sprinting directly at him as the cutscene ends and then strafing around him, at which point you have about a 4 to 5 second opening to just spam your strongest attacks at him in melee range. Usually this will cause a stagger for most builds, which then lets you get a crit against him, and with any strong build, this will also put him to the exact phase transition point that he does the explosion I mentioned earlier. A lot of the bosses feel way better the more that you fight them. That is pretty typical for this kind of game, but Midra specifically feels like a well choreographed dance once you learn it properly. The flip side of all my praise for the bosses though then is a point that I saw brought up recently that I hadn't really thought of until then, but the majority of Remembrance bosses in the DLC don't actually have cutscenes, and many of them don't even have voice lines. You learn their lore from their items that you can get afterwards, or from things that happen after they die, or only if you interact with specific NPCs as well, but in the base game, how many of the Remembrance bosses came without at least one cutscene? That number, very low. Rolana says nothing about who she is, what she wants, where she came from, it's all 100% in items. Saint of the Bud, I mean, this is a goddamn Lovecraftian horror creature that could live in people's nightmares for the rest of their lives after they see it here, and she doesn't say a single word. There's no cutscene, there's no weird bug noises even. You just enter a room after being told it's where you need to go, and bam, there's this crazy, inexplicable thing sitting right in front of you. Even Messmer, one of the main antagonists, got extremely little explanation to who he was or why he did what he did until you walk into the boss room itself. The NPCs will mention him as an importance, and they will try to direct you towards the Shadow Keep. They will hint at his mother, and they'll say he's responsible for the war against the Hornsent, but if you cut out the stuff that you learn from the trailers before even playing the DLC, and only look at what you can find out about him in the game, it's actually an extremely small amount before you actually walk into the boss room itself. That said, I don't think this makes them bad by any means, and FromSoft is known in these games for putting a lot of lore into the items themselves, but I noticed it more in this DLC than I did in the base game for sure, that it just felt like it was very little upfront storytelling, and I think we could have used a lot more voice lines or pre-fight cutscenes to really hype them all up. That said though, on the sort of flip side to that entire point is Bale the Dread. Bale has no cutscene, and if you fight him raw, you'll just be sort of undertaking a crazy experience of a fight. But the exposition for him comes from doing NPC quests, and specifically if you get to summon Egon into the Bale fight, you basically get an active cutscene that plays as you fight with his extremely epic speech going on. I love Egon, I love everything about this whole interaction, and it is just so good. And past that, I do want to say that this set of boss music, the music for every boss in the DLC, is honestly so incredible. I think that as a whole, if we look at the quality of the full just sort of a collection of Remembrance boss music, I think it rivals, if not surpasses, what we had in the base game, which was also incredible. Moving on past the bosses, then I want to talk about the map, the exploration, the visuals of it all, the kind of atmospheric type stuff. First things first, Miyazaki said this DLC was the size of Limgrave, and unless Caelid is now being called East Limgrave and Liurnia is now North Limgrave, I think that is one of the biggest undersells I have ever heard of in gaming. The map is huge, the verticality of it is ridiculously intricate and intriguing. Compared to the density of the base game though, there are way less like caves and dungeons around the place, way less random important items or enemies just around, but the world is so absolutely gorgeous, and the actual size and depths of these caves and dungeons when you do find them makes it feel even more rewarding when you do somehow. It takes more exploration in between each thing that you find, but the exploration itself is so enjoyable that it makes it feel like it's not even a problem, and the reward when you find a cave and it opens up a whole new region, or you find a a ladder descending underneath the Shadow Keep, and then there's an illusion wall in the back room that leads to a coffin that goes to a river that you can find a dungeon at the bottom of with a caved out hole in the back of it that leads to a forest full of madness. How ludicrous is that when you phrase it that way? A whole section of the map locked behind a dungeon hidden at the end of a descending river path past an illusion wall that was already in a secret area. And this also leads on to my next point about this, which is that I really love the way that they seem to sort of delve into the whole player messages system much harder with the DLC. That illusion wall would be nearly unnoticeable without a pile of messages in front of it, because there are so few illusion walls in the DLC that you aren't just hitting everything you walk past. There is a bridge in front of the Ancient Ruins area as well, and a full-on bridge that is entirely invisible, an illusion bridge. And the only real hint that it even exists is if you walk near it, you will see player messages left along the path to show you that you can stand there. It's just such a neat way to make a unique system like the messages, and then use its existence to sort of excuse gratuitously complex hidden areas are things that not even 1% of players would ever actually find if it weren't for either those messages or internet guides. And I love that it actually works too, that people do find them because the messages do get used. Then there are a whole host of new weapons and spells and talismans and all of the new toys to play around with, and I think the majority of the new weapons are very thematically cool. However, a lot of the ones with unique skills specifically have been left a little bit undertuned, it feels like, specifically because they know quite well what players made broken in the base game, and it feels like they designed a lot of DLC weapons and spells to try and avoid letting us stack these synergies the same way. A lot of skills aren't chargeable or don't trigger multi-hit bonuses, and if they do, they likely don't do both, and they don't have any sort of elemental damage component, so you can't really boost that part of them either, and the ones that are boostable in a bunch of ways are generally scaled so low they don't feel that strong even when fully made around. Of course, there are a good few exceptions to that. I'm not saying this applies to everything, but for the most part, the star weapons of the DLC have all been just good, strong weapons that are infusible with Ashes of War, which allows more player control of its strength. That said, there are also some absolutely broken weapons too. There are some sad ones, but again, most of them aren't fun, and the same goes for the new spells too, regardless of power. If I had one major complaint about all this stuff that's been added, it's that they added a bunch of new types of weapons and even new schools of magic too, but then they just underfilled them. There are 2 beast claws in the entire game. There are 2 hand-to-hand weapons, neither with unique skill, even though they do have different movesets. There are 3 light greatswords, and only one of them is infusible with Ashes of War. There are 3 backhand blades, and they also only have 1 infusible, 1 throwing dagger, just the 1, and while you could argue it is just one of these Smith script weapons, the devs themselves gave it its own weapon category, and the sad part is, it's pretty bad too. Point being, they added a lot of really cool things, even the concept of Bear Communion incantations, and then they added 1 Bear Communion incantation. Yes, even in the lore of the spell it is a joke, but the point still stands. The sort of spread shot to create a lot of different concepts without filling the various ones in with more variety, and while I do really like a lot of what we got, that specific part takes a little bit away from me. But then there are cool things like the Priestess Heart and the Rock Heart that are full on like transformation items that are actually really strong in the right build too. So it's very give and take on the new stuff for me. I love that there's new stuff, I love the amount of new stuff, I love the variety, but I wish they put a little bit more into weapons of the new types that they've added, rather than adding in things like regular axes or straight swords, and I wish they didn't work so hard to limit how much synergy that the actual new stuff seems to have. Overall, I don't generally like giving things ratings in a review type thing. That's just not how I view reviews. I think the whole point is the discussion along the way, and you probably have a pretty good idea of my opinion on the DLC from this. But I would say the DLC isn't quite perfect, but nothing is. To put it simply, this is my game of the year currently, and it's not even a game technically in that sense because it's a DLC, but it is one that is filled with more content than most AAA games even have from the start of them. One with a really satisfying story once you start to piece it all together too, and one with an incredibly large and satisfying map to explore as well. I am both sad to know that there are no plans for a second DLC to Elden Ring, and extremely intrigued to see what will follow Elden Ring as the next full title from FromSoft. That just about does it for today then, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed me just sort of going on and rambling about what I like and don't like about the DLC, and of course feel free to leave your own thoughts about all of this in the comments down below, but remember, at the end of the day, all this stuff is just my own opinion. But it is, however, the opinion of someone who has far too much playtime in this DLC. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.